Okay, good afternoon, Jackie.
Hello, Paul. How are you?
Fine. This afternoon I'm going to be interviewing Jackie Arnold. Jackie's a colleague of mine. She's done a lot of things in her career. She's been a business English teacher. She's owned language schools, and most importantly for this interview, she's been a coach. Would you like to say a few words about how the different sides of your career interrelate?
Yes, certainly, Paul. Um, well, I first of all worked as an English teacher abroad in Switzerland, and I did my normal TEFL diploma and qualifications over there, and worked for a long time in a school over there, and set up another school in Lucerne in Switzerland. And then when I came back to the UK, I set my own school up in Brighton, here on the south coast, and I had that and ran that for 14 years. And at the end of that, I decided to train as a coach. And then I became a business coach after 3 years training and sold my school. And I've been doing that pretty much ever since. And also working at several schools along the south coast as a business English teacher. So combining the two and bringing the coaching skills that I've learned to the EFL world, which has been quite interesting.
So just to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about, first we're going just to talk about what is coaching. Then we're going to say a little bit about coaching techniques, and finally we're going to talk about coaching and its relevance to business English. So let's begin with the question of what is coaching, and I thought that I could begin with my own understanding and then you could add or clarify anything. It's very important that the coach allows the coachee to come to ideas and solutions and conclusions for themselves, and that the coach doesn't put ideas into the coachee's head.
It's the belief that the person in front of you, as a teacher in this case, as a teacher coach if you like, the belief that the person in front of you actually knows quite a bit about their own world and about their own development, and actually can identify strategies and ways forward that the teacher may not necessarily have thought appropriate for them. It's very much better for that person to have found the way forward for themselves, and it's much more motivating.
So in terms of techniques, something that you and I have talked quite a lot about is the GROW model. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, the GROW model was developed by John Whitmore. John Whitmore has written a wonderful book about coaching called Coaching for Performance, which has been used widely. And in that, he developed the GROW model, and it's a model for taking somebody from A to B, effectively. So with coaching, as you said at the beginning, usually people have very clear outcomes or a goal. So the G starts for goal. So what we do is we try to get the person to think of a goal, but not just I want to learn better English, but I want to develop my English so that I can be more professional in my role, in my job, and then that will give me more confidence in my role and enable me to get promotion. So we try to get someone to identify a very interesting, motivating goal to begin with. Then we move down to the R, which is reality, and there we invite people to think about what is actually true about that goal right now. So have they done anything towards that goal? What steps have they already taken? So we dig down into the reality for quite a while, asking questions, reflecting back, etc., getting a very clear picture of the reality of the current goal. Then move towards O, which is options or opportunities. What opportunities, what options are open to that person? So looking at the goal, looking at the reality, what possibilities are there? And again, we help them to identify those possibilities. Then we move on to the W, which is the way forward. And we ask about possible action points. So for example, what would you now be willing to do towards this particular goal? 1 step, 2 steps, and identify some very clear action points at the end of it they can take forward. First of all, short term, but also long term. And that's effectively how the GROW model works.
Okay, let's run through a few of the techniques. So the first one is active listening. What exactly does a coach mean by active listening?
It's a deeper kind of listening. So perhaps you're also listening for what is not said. You're listening for nuances in the language that perhaps you wouldn't have noticed before. I ask them questions that will enable me to see their world, so to identify where they're coming from. And I try to keep as much as possible my own thoughts and my own chatter out of the conversation, so that I am actually there with them in their world, and I am recognising and empathising with their position. So it's about reading people with your ears and your eyes.
And one other particular technique that I know you use is to listen for words that the coachee uses which are charged with some feeling or emotion, and then reflect those same words back to the coachee, perhaps with a questioning tone of voice.
I'm very aware of the kind of language that a student uses, and I try to match that language as far as possible to help them to feel more comfortable in the session, and also to be able for them to be able to think more clearly. So if I'm in their world with them and immersed in their kind of language, then I can perhaps empathise better and help them to move forward quicker.
So you're picking up on key words that the student uses and reflecting those back to the student. Would that also be true of body language as well as language?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. I think very often, a student comes in, they're very nervous, and they might be sitting in a fairly nervous position. And if we sit there very relaxed, it might make them feel even more nervous. But if we kind of try to emulate the way that they're sitting, the way that they're moving, they probably would feel more comfortable. Obviously you don't want to mirror completely, but it does help people to feel more relaxed if you are more the way they are. Because we are very much more inclined to gain rapport with someone if we feel that they're like us. And so therefore it's not only the body language but also the voice tone quite often. So if somebody speaks very quickly and I'm speaking quite slowly, then we're not in rapport with each other. We're not working together. So I try to match the students' tone and pace as well as their language.
So we had picking up on words that the coachee uses or that the student uses, mirroring their body language, matching their tone and pace of speech, and perhaps matching their energy levels also. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Yes, I'd just like to come back to the energy levels. Obviously, if a student comes in and they're very depressed, angry, emotional, matching that is effective, but obviously we don't want them to stay there. So I would see the role of a coach as to bring them slowly out of that depressed emotional state and help them to get back on track. So it's about not being opposite to them at the beginning, but actually bringing them out of that state as far as possible by leading, in this case, and this is an NLP technique, but leading people out of that state and helping them to feel more motivated, helping them to relax into the lesson.
Something else that we plan to talk about is reflective feedback. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, I think feedback is one of the most valuable things that we can give to a student, because not only we're using their language so that they understand, but also we're then putting our own language in. And students learn by listening to the teacher very often too. So part of the reflective feedback is, what I heard you say was that your boss was being a little bit aggressive and that you wanted to learn how to cope with that better in your work environment, so that they hear back what they have brought as a problem potentially. And very often hearing their own language and their own thoughts going back to them clarifies it for them, and it becomes much easier for them to understand.
Can we just be clear about the term feedback? So there's two kinds of feedback. There's coach feedback, which is about personal issues, and then there's language feedback. And with a business English student, you can give language feedback in a non-coaching way or a coaching way.
When you're coaching, you very much work with the student's knowledge. So you would say, okay, did you notice that when you were talking about so and so and so and so, you use present continuous and present simple? Do you think that another tense might be more appropriate? How would you now say that, hearing that back? And you would hope that they would come up with their answers themselves. However, if that answer was not forthcoming, then obviously as a teacher you would then show them the correct way to do it. So that you come out of coach mode, you go into coach mode and out of coach mode. I wouldn't say you stay in coach mode the whole time.
Another thing that we wanted to talk about in terms of technique is the use of questions. As a business English teacher, I'm used to asking questions like, can you say a little bit more about that? Or can you be a little bit more specific? What exactly do you mean by that? So trying to get the student to drill down to a greater level of detail and talk about their business in more detail. Would those be coaching-like questions?
Absolutely, yes, very much so, yes. So it's also quite often, I think we use more words than we need to. Sometimes very, very effective question could just be, is there anything else about that? So for example, a student might say to you, oh, I want to learn how to work better at interviews, come to an interview with more confidence. And then you say, oh, more confidence. Is there anything else about confidence? So again, you're using their words and coming back with a question about something that they've used. So that's very effective. And then there are other things like, what kind of is that? What else could you say about that? And those questions, although quite simple, they do go down deeper and does make the student think more about what they're saying and how they're saying it.
Now we're going to look at three very concrete cases. In the first one, we're going to take an example of a real student that you recently had. This was a Polish woman, and it was a very normal class where she was simply telling you about her company.
So what I asked the student to do was because she had some difficult situations that she was in between herself, her team, and a supplier. And so what I asked her to do was to build her team. So what she did was she built a room like this, and she put a few desks in it around the room to show, actually it was a little bit bigger than that, she showed the desks as they were placed in the room. And she talked then a little bit about the people that she was engaged with and the roles that they had. And what she said to me was that she found this very, very motivating and very, very easy to visualize, because she said that beforehand she was thinking in her head, and seeing it on the table made it much easier for her to talk about. So for example, she told me she was very visual, which is why I brought the rods in. And then she had a situation with a supplier, and she put the supplier out here and said that he was always late with delivery, etc., but they'd worked with him for a long time, and she actually had an idea about how she might approach this with her team, and it became very much more clear for her when she was talking about this with a visual stimulus. So whilst we were doing the lesson, I asked her a few questions, but she was absolutely in this situation on the table. She wasn't in the English classroom at all. She was actually in her own company. And it made it so much easier for her to talk about it. And afterwards, she said it made it real. And she said, what I really appreciated was that you were non-intrusive. And I think that's something else. As a coach, you learn to be very non-obtrusive. And so I allowed her, with very short, very calm questioning, to work in her own world within her own language ability.
So what you were doing here was making it objective. It was not something in her head, it was not something back in Poland, it was pieces of wood on a table. You weren't doing anything else very clever, you weren't moving pieces of wood around, one piece of wood wasn't talking to another piece of wood.
No, she actually did it all. I didn't do any of it. It was her role to put the things where she wanted to, and I kept on saying, I kept on checking with her, you know, is that person in the right place in regard to you? So, for example, is that, you know, do you feel that's in the right position? Yes, she said, and then sometimes she moved it a bit further away. It's almost like she brought her company into the classroom with her. And as she said, you know, it made it much more powerful for her to be able to think about the dynamics that were going on and to solve it herself, in fact. Because I don't know, as a coach, I don't know the dynamics of the company. I don't know the people she works with. I have no contact with her supplier. So the only person that knows about this situation is her.
Good, thank you. So the second very concrete case of the use of coaching in business English is when a student comes to us and says that they want to do practice in job interviews. Perhaps they're in a period of transition in their life. That's why they've come to the business English course. They're hoping to get a better job and they want us to help them in that job interview. How can coaching techniques help us to prepare that student?
Now, one of the things that they can do is to use affirmations. And affirmations are present tense statements that they make about themselves that may not yet be true, but are really very helpful for them. So one of the preparation techniques would be, I am successful at this interview. I can speak fluently in my language. I understand my industry. I research my role very well. So I would invite them to write down some present tense statements in a positive way about themselves regarding the interview to begin with. So that's how I'd start. If we start out with positive affirmations, that's one of the ways we can prepare. Also, I would ask them a lot more questions now about how they feel about the interview, what they think about the interview, how much do they know about the company. So there would be a lot more in-depth questioning and finding out about my student than I perhaps would have done in the past. So that's a proviso. During the interview, I would then ask the student to relax and give them some relaxation techniques of breathing, because one of the reasons why people are not very confident in interview is because they're speaking a lot and then they lose their breath and they dry up and they can't think of what they want to say. And oxygen, taking oxygen into the brain, actually helps thought processes. It stimulates the thought process.
Let's take our third concrete case, which is where a student tells us that they're interested in discussing motivation. What do you do?
If I could take a scenario that I've been teaching recently, and that was somebody who came who had a reasonably large team of people, about 14 or 15 people that he managed. And he said, but I find it really difficult to motivate my team. And how do you think I might do that? And, you know, could you help me with that? So we did all the preparation of it by asking, first of all, you know, what the team were like, how they worked together, what he'd done in the past to motivate his team. These people were very demotivated, actually. And so I said to him, what is it actually that you really want to do with this team? And he outlined exactly what he wanted to do. And then I would take him back to what we started with, which is the GROW model. And I'd say to him, okay, your goal is what? And what is the reality of this motivation? And what opportunities do you have to motivate? And what would you do to motivate? So I draw that all out of him, first of all, perhaps using something like the GROW model. And also to be aware that actually people are motivated in different parts of their life by different things. For example, a young married person with children is obviously going to be motivated by the amount of salary he gets, the amount of time he gets free. That's his motivation. Whereas somebody whose children have flown the nest, they've gone to university, might be motivated by actually working quite hard at the moment and then having more free time when they're pensioned. So it's different motivation for different times of people's lives, and also sometimes people are motivated by promotion and some people are not. Some people want to stay in the job that they've got, they're quite content. So it's useful to find out on a one-to-one situation perhaps where their motivation lies. If he's thinking of the team as a whole, then again I would say that coaching people is much more motivating than telling them. So I might explain that. I might explain the coaching techniques to him. and say, actually, what would happen if you asked your team what would motivate them? What would happen if you said to your team, I feel that there is not much motivation in the team. What would help you in this scenario? What would motivate you? What would make you want to work harder in this particular context? And see what they come up with. And again, that's something that he found very useful.
Well, I think we've come to the end. Before we finish, I'd just like to do a little bit of cross-promotion for your website and for your books. Your website is www.coachforexecutives.com, and that's a number 4. And you've written a number of books. So in chronological order, your first book was called Raise Your Glasses, Please. Would you like to say a few words about that?
So that's a very brief book about short speeches that you might make at a wedding, funeral, etc. And got some useful quotes and proverbs and sayings and things that you might find easy to slot into your speeches. And it's also got a couple of sample short speeches. Gives you tips and techniques about how to not dry up and how to keep focused on what you want to say.
And the next book is called Teach Yourself to Make a Great Speech. It's published by Hodder Education and it's available for the Kindle. Would you like to say something about that?
The first part of the book is very much more in-depth tips and techniques about how to avoid fear of public speaking. It has sample speeches in it, and at the end of it, it has a particular business section where you can look for interview techniques, telephone techniques, speaking at a conference, speaking at seminars, holding a business meeting, etc., etc. And it's very clearly laid out with tips and techniques in each chapter. And it's, as you say, it's called Make a Great Speech.
And we ought to make it clear before we continue that these books are written for native speakers. They're not business English books.
They are, yes, yes.
And now we'll come on to your third and most recent book, which is called Coaching Skills for Leaders in the Workplace. Would you like to say something about that one?
Yes, this is to help people to motivate. Actually, we're talking about motivation. It's helping people to motivate their staff. And it's recognised by the London Chamber of Commerce and also the ILM, which is the Institute of Leadership and Management. And they've endorsed the book as part of their course in coaching and mentoring skills. So it is actually used for their qualification as well. And it's a book for internal people who are working as managers, as coaches, and they want to know some coaching techniques, the difference between coaching and mentoring. It's very clearly laid out. And there are some strategies and skills and techniques that you can take forward as a manager, as coach.
Great. Thank you very much, Jackie.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.